Hi, everybody. My name is John McGovern. Thanks for joining us for the Town Darien ADA Transition Plan Community Engagement Process. I lead the accessibility practice at the WT Group, and the Western Connecticut Council of Governments retained us to do transition planning work for 16 communities out of the 18 WestCog communities. And with us from WestCog is Mike Wilson in the back left. He's waving his hand. And on my team as well is Laurel Heisman. Laurel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'd love to. I'm Laurel Heisman. I'm a certified therapeutic recreation specialist, and I reside in Texas. My background is in parks and recreation, providing programs, access and inclusion for people with disabilities in both Texas and the state of North Carolina. And then I joined the WT group about 2 years ago, and I do access audits and prepare transition plans.
Great. And my background is local government too. I worked in New Mexico and in Illinois for local governments, always responsible for making sure that parks and facilities were accessible to people with disabilities, but also that programs and policies and processes were inclusive of people with disabilities. I recognized, of course, as everybody in the room does, that cities and towns have a moral obligation to make sure that people with disabilities can use their sites. I was curious about whether there was a legal obligation, so I went to law school at night and graduated right about the time the ADA became law. So kind of right place at the right time for me. And since 2008, when the Accessibility Practice formed, we've helped more than 720 counties and towns and cities and the occasional state comply with the not so always crystal clear requirements of the ADA. So on the next slide, we're going to ask you to introduce yourself. I'll keep talking about the purpose though. Our goal for this session today and then the similar session tonight is to determine whether or not town residents have a preference for the order of retrofit for existing sites. That's really the key to the community engagement obligation. So we will talk a little bit about what the Department of Justice says with regard to existing sites, and then we'll show you some pictures that give you a sense of what we saw at some of the sites. None of this is intended to be a deep dive into any one site, but we think you'll get a sense of the process. And we've got the right size group to make it interactive. So if you see something on a slide that you want to talk about, you can either be polite and raise your hand, or you can just shout it out, and we can accommodate you either way. So that said, we have
Carrie Jarnice, sign language interpreter for today's meeting.
Thank you. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself, even though I pointed you out?
Yes, Mike Wilson, Senior Planner with WestCog. As John mentioned, we saw a need on a region-wide basis for this type of service, so we cobbled up the funds and engaged. John is very modest because we sort of did a nationwide search for who consultants to hire, and they came out on top.
Well, like I said, Mike, right place at the right time. With us from the town?
Jennifer Charneski, and I'm the town administrator.
Great. And then members of the public, if you could tell us your name and what interests you, what brought you to the meeting tonight.
I'm Lori Gore. I'm the chair of the Parks and Recreation Commission.
Great.
And I think this will impact our work in the park, so it's important that I participate.
Thanks for coming, Lori. Hi.
Hi, Marley Hayes. I am the communications manager for the town, but also a resident of the town and a child of an aging parent going through many of things that ADA affects. So I'm here with a couple hats on.
Great. Thanks, Marley. And that's an important point. I think a lot of times people tend to think of the ADA and disability, and they see a child or a younger person in a wheelchair, but it's certainly a demographic issue that affects all the age groups.
Yes, it is.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Jan Raymond. I live in town. I've had an interest in this area for a long time, since my friend from 5th grade got in a wheelchair in 1993, and I have 2 friends, good friends in walkers, one of which is moving to a wheelchair. So that's one interest. The other interest is in what the town's responsibility is to what we do and how we do it.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Laurel, if you don't mind, so I'm not stepping in front of Carrie. So the project scope of work is broad, and that's appropriate because the ADA requirements are broad. The ADA, as everybody gets up instantly to close it up, the ADA requires towns to do employment differently. So that's in Title I of the ADA. We'll talk a little bit about that. That's not our scope. But certainly from a facility or infrastructure perspective and a program or policy perspective, it's consistent with the scope of work. Access audits of parks and facilities, so every existing site has to be evaluated to determine whether or not it is consistent with the requirements for design. Community engagement, so again, this session and the session tonight, those are mandated. We are also doing an online survey, so you'll see, I think, the link on the last page. And we urge you to tell your friends and neighbors and family members to complete the survey. We're in particular interested, again, in the thoughts that people who have a disability might have about what's the order of retrofit, what should be made accessible first before the other items are addressed. Our scope also includes the phased retrofit schedule. That's just a transition plan. So it lays out over time what work will occur when and who's responsible. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then last but not least is an audit of both public-facing policies, so things like service animal policies, as well as how the town invites, analyzes, and then fulfills requests for support or reasonable modifications from people who have a disability. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of those coming up. The next slide talks a little bit about us. So as Mike said, we are not from here. We are headquartered in Illinois, but we work all over the country. We've had other jobs in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, to California, to Oregon, to Wisconsin, Florida, to Minnesota. We prefer to be in Florida. So we work all over the country. We do have remote employees as well. We've embraced, if anybody can say that, the pandemic, and we realize that not everybody has to live in the Chicago area where our headquarters is. So Laurel is a native Texan and lives in the Dallas area. We have another employee that lives in the Austin area, another employee that lives in Norfolk, and most of the rest of our accessibility team are in the Chicago metro area. But these are some of the things that we do. We do a lot of plan review, a lot of staff training, a lot of access audits. We've seen more and more emphasis on making sidewalks and public right-of-way accessible, so we've been involved in that as well. So what is the ADA? You're probably familiar with it, but I'm going to walk through this and try to give it to you in the way it connects to our scope of work. So the ADA became law. It became effective on January 26 of 1992. President Bush signed it on July 26 of 1990, and it was a really significant piece of legislation then. Think about Congress today. In 1990, when this was signed, 85% of the members of Congress voted yes. Sponsors were from both sides of the aisle in both the House and the Senate. It was a bill at the right time, in the right place. I think today you couldn't get 85% of the members of Congress to agree that it's dark at night. So this is a really significant piece of legislation and arguably one of the last big pieces that got a lot of bipartisan support. So I mentioned employment before. Title I is the part of the ADA that addresses employment. It's very different than the other parts of the ADA, and it tells employers, whether it's a unit of local government or state government, or a private entity or a nonprofit, that they can't discriminate on the basis of disability in the hiring process and in how they treat employees. And In 1990, when this was signed into law, 67% of people who have a disability were either unemployed or underemployed. So Jan, right?
Mhm.
What do you think that percentage is today?
Well, I don't know what the percentage is, but I would hope and suspect it's lower.
It is, but not by as much as we would all hope. It is only 66%.
Oh.
So in 34 years, we've only moved the needle by 1%. So arguably, the employment portion of the ADA has been the least effective part of the law. The second bullet point, though, is the big success story, and that's units of state and local government. There are 89,000 units of state and local government spread across the country, ranging from towns to big cities, to counties, to special purpose districts, and so forth. And they have really embraced the requirements for a transition plan, for the evaluation of existing sites, and for the idea that if a town provides a service, it should be available to both people with and without a disability. So that's been a really key part of the success of the ADA. Title III is the third bullet point, and that addresses privately owned places of public accommodation. So the place that you might have had lunch at today, or the grocery store that you shop at, or we're still sort of kind of in tax season, your accountant's office, your lawyer's office, wherever you buy a car at. So all of those privately owned places have to make the same types of modifications, but their test is much easier than the test that the town has to meet for existing sites. For a business, they only have to make changes that are readily achievable, which is loosely defined as cheap and easy to do. The town has to meet what's called the program access test, which is much more difficult to meet, and we'll dive into that in a little bit more. Last but not least is telecommunications. I don't have my phone on me. Laurel, can you hold yours up? So technology has made some parts of the ADA, I'll say almost obsolete. There were very, very few people who had a smartphone in 1990, if anybody. But today, if I'm a person who's deaf and I want to go to a golf course or a swimming pool, I can give my phone number to the desk at the golf course. And if there's an emergency and I can't hear the sirens, I'll certainly see the text and I'll know that I have to leave the course. So technology's had a big impact on making more sites accessible and also making more programs compliant and inclusive.
Can I ask a question? How does the law affect universities? I'm on a board of it at a university, and when I was in, I graduated from Syracuse in 1965, but during my time there, they were already taking sidewalks and making them wheelchair accessible. Not everything, but I remember seeing it and wondering what they were doing. And now, do they fall under one part of the?
Yes. So Syracuse, if I recall, is a state university, right?
No.
Go Orange?
No,
Oh, it's not.
private.
Syracuse is a private
It
university?
is. A lot of people think that because Albany and Buffalo and all the SUNYs are named after towns.
Well, then Syracuse, if it is privately owned and operated, it's a Title III entity, so their obligation is different. There's a catch here, and that's the fact that I'm sure Syracuse receives federal funds. So if
Less than they did.
Pardon?
Less than they did a year ago.
That's true. So certainly if a private entity does receive federal funds, like a university, so whether it's research grants or infrastructure grants, then the program that is being funded by that federal money, or that state money too, it could also be state money, does have to be made accessible. It's interesting that you use sidewalks in your question, because sidewalk requirements as far as width, surface, the distance of gaps, the changes in level along the surface, those have been around for decades, but they were just adopted by the Department of Transportation, and they just became effective January 17th of 2025. So we've known what they look like, but they weren't final and enforceable until literally just, what
3
is
months
that?
ago.
3.5, 4 months ago.
Yeah.
So did you mean that if a university receives federal funds for a research project, where you go for the research project, that building has to be accessible, but does the rest of the university that's not getting a grant, does that mean they're allowed to? I do college counseling, that's why I'm asking.
There's a concept called the concept of disproportionality. So if I get a grant to fix this asset, this chair the chair is just a symbol, at a site, and let's just say it's a $100,000 project, then I have to be prepared to spend up to 20% of that $100,000, so $20,000, on what's called the path of travel. So the way we would usually define that is start out front. Is the accessible parking the right slope? Are the stripes the right width? Is the sign proper? Can I get to the front door? Can I open the front door with what we suggest as a smart practice, 8.5 pounds of force? If there's an interior door with a closure like this door, can I open it with less than 5 pounds of force? So if all those changes exhaust the $20,000 for this $100,000 project, then you can stop there. You don't have to, but you can stop there. So the notion that if you get any federal money, you have to make every single thing at the site accessible, that's not correct. The next slide talks a little bit more about Title II. So it certainly governs, as I said earlier, almost everything that Darien does. So if there are parks with picnic tables and playgrounds and sports fields, those are governed by Title II as far as the processes and policies, but also Title II is what tells you have to follow the design standards. So one of the things that is crystal clear within the ADA is that design and construction of new sites must fully comply with, and for here, look at the bottom bullet point, must fully comply with the final and enforceable federal guidelines and any final and enforceable state of Connecticut guidelines, or even arguably if the county had adopted a code that was more stringent, you would apply that, or if the town had adopted a code that was more stringent, you would apply that as well. The Connecticut standards as well as the federal standards are both about 220 pages long. That said, they're still incomplete. Connecticut and the feds have not yet adopted guidance regarding trails, final and enforceable guidance regarding beaches, final and enforceable guidance about picnic tables, which is one of the most common elements that you'll see in a park. So there's still some unfinished business here. This has tended to be in recent years more of a state topic. So Illinois adopted the pending federal guidance about 7 years ago. Texas is doing it this year. New Jersey has always had a more stringent barrier-free subcode. Florida has some requirements that are more stringent regarding parking, for example. Texas does as well. And think about some of the new things that we're starting to see in the infrastructure. So EV charging stations. How do you make those accessible? Where is the access aisle? How many do I have to have that are accessible? So those two are starting to be addressed more by the states than by the federal government. I think under this administration, it's reasonable to say that there are going to be very few accessibility-related regulations that are issued that are new. So we're going to tend to look at the states here. The third bullet point is really the guts of our work. Laurel was talking about the access audit. That's what we refer to the process as. So when we do an access audit, you'll see this in some of the pictures. We look at every single thing at a site. And then we determine what would make the programs at that site accessible. And I'll talk a little bit more about the idea of programs here coming up. So the town has to make the programs available in the most integrated setting. So that means that I'm a person with a disability and you're in the same program with me and you don't have a disability, then it's not just that we're in the same room together, it's that we interact together. So whether we're playing cards or doing a travel log or talking about whatever the topic is, or taking a Spanish class or something like that, we're interacting together as peers in the program. The town also has an obligation to make modifications to support participation by people who have a disability. So in employment, those supports are called a reasonable accommodation. In programs and services and facilities, they're called a reasonable modification. And they range from things like providing a sign language interpreter to providing staff who are going to support a person with a disability with additional staff training, to providing even additional staff in a program that can help with managing behavior and so forth. The third bullet point is kind of a nuanced requirement. A lot of towns use contractors to run a program at a site that they operate. So if I own John's Zumba here in Darien, and the town hires me to, at a town site, run Zumba classes, then I too can't discriminate on the basis of disability. So if Laurel shows up with a relative who's on the autism spectrum, I'm obliged to welcome them and provide support so that that person on the autism spectrum can enjoy Zumba taught in only the way that I can teach Zumba. So this is kind of a catchy one. That Zumba provider also has their own obligation, but think of it this way. It's not right for somebody providing a service in a taxpayer paid for facility to be able to discriminate on the basis of anything: gender, ethnicity, cultural background, religious beliefs, and as well as disability.
May I interrupt? In that scenario, is the town responsible to always have somebody available to help in Zumba, or does the person with the disability have to make themselves known previously?
Ideally, the registration process that the town uses has me indicate I want to participate in Zumba. My name is John McGovern. I live at 10 Hancock Road. Here's my Visa card. And then if it doesn't bounce, the drop down should next be, I need a modification because of disability to participate in this program, yes or no. And I cannot go farther in the registration without telling you yes or no.
Okay.
And if I say yes, then the town is obliged to reach out to me and say, hey, welcome to Zumba. You checked yes, that you need a modification.
What is it?
Can we put together a Zoom meeting, or can we meet you either at your house, or can you come here and we can talk about how we can provide the support for you?
Understood, thank you.
I think the bottom bullet point is, again, another nuanced type of issue. Towns can't make people with a disability, I'm going to phrase this in a different way than it's in the PowerPoint. Towns can't make people with disabilities jump through an administrative hoop that people without a disability don't have to jump through. So in a state near you, we saw a Recreation and Park Department registration form, and it was clear that they had been to an ADA workshop, so they asked, do you need a modification to participate in the program? And if you said yes, then the next drop down was, you must call the town administrator now and talk to the town administrator about the modification. Well, is that really necessary? If a person without a disability signs up, they don't have to call Jen, in this example, and talk to her about their participation in the class. So I firmly believe that requirements like that do keep some people from taking that next step, because not that Jen would be unpleasant to talk with, but who really wants to call the town administrator when really all you want to do is take the class? So the next slide is a little bit more about Title II, and it's the concept of program access. So yes, a program can be a thing, an activity, for example, that meets at a certain time, like every Tuesday at 5 to 6:30 for 8 weeks, and the fee is $17 per meeting. But a program is really an opportunity that the town makes available. So the opportunity for me to go to a town board meeting and make public comment, that's a program. So the opportunity for me to sit in a park, grab a picnic table, and eat a Subway sandwich is a program. So think broadly here when you hear the word program in an ADA context. It's really talking about an opportunity that the town makes available to me. Third bullet point talks about the notion that, and this is kind of counterintuitive, but Congress made it really clear that not necessarily every existing site that a town or a city or a unit of state or local government has must be made accessible. So instead they created this program access test, and I'll kind of tell you how they saw it going. Both Congress and Justice did avoid telling you here's the ratio for similar sites. So I'll use an example that I often use. If a town has 9 playgrounds, what do you think? Is making one only playground accessible, is that enough to say the program of playgrounds is accessible?
I would think not, but.
All right, so we got a no here. Would you think making all 9 accessible is required?
No.
From what you're saying, it's not required, but I think it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do.
And that's what we've been doing. is
It's
we've
not
been doing
required.
playgrounds.
So the idea of 1 of 3 is just ours. I can tell you the Department of Justice has signed off on that. The Department of Interior has, federal district courts have, and a couple of state enforcement agencies have as well.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again? Of the playgrounds, 1 out of 3 has to be?
That's our recommendation as a smart practice, that a minimum of 1 of every 3 of recurring assets.
Okay.
And so the way it would work is we're going to finish our report to the town of Darien, let's say August 1. It's going to identify 3 playgrounds, assuming there are 9, that we think either are accessible and just need to be maintained or could easily be made accessible. So let's say we do that and the town addresses that in 2026 in this hypothetical. Then in 2028, there's another playground that the town has that's now 26 years old, and so it's replaced just because of its age. So now we have 4 out of 9 that are accessible. Then in 2030, they replace another playground that's also 28 years old. Now we have 5 out of 9 that are accessible. So that was the path that Congress wanted to see local governments take. Start with a chunk and then incrementally work your way forward on recurring assets that are similar to each other.
To clarify, though, you're talking about retrofitting. Because
Correct.
It's my understanding as we rebuild playgrounds, which we have done.
Correct. So can you go back 2 slides, I think, to the new?
Yeah, so the new ones we have,
Yeah.
has been our understanding, and what we've done is make them
Absolutely.
compliant.
So,
Okay, so this is just an existing playground, you're like, it's good, the equipment's only 10 years old.
yeah, and there's,
Okay.
kind of, excuse the awkwardness of this, but there's an interface between new, which absolutely positively has to be compliant with the final and enforceable standards, and then existing. And existing is a little more waffly,
Right.
so it requires a bit more interpretation. Can you go back to where we were? Thanks.
Yeah, can I ask another question, or?
Sure, please.
Yeah, because one area that we get asked about sometimes is, and I guess you guys have done the inventory, I think you've been out in the parks already, but we can broadly put our parks in 2 buckets, and there's one that we call like the active parks, where there's playgrounds, there's ball fields, tennis courts, pickleball courts, whatever, and then we have what we call our nature preserves. And people will also say, well, none of the nature preserves are accessible, and when we try to, when we're looking for funds for projects and improvements that we're working on now, and we talk about the importance of having firm and stable surfaces, which is the firm that our designers use, and the importance of that, when people say, well, you don't have that at Woodland Park because it's a nature preserve. So would the nature preserves be like in one bucket? Because they are trickier by definition. They're paths through woods.
They are, but it to a certain extent, it depends on what's there.
Okay. So you'll be guiding us on that when we get the
We will,
report? Okay.
and just as an example, again, if that nature preserve is, let's start at the lowest level, if it is nothing but a meadow, and there is nothing there. You haven't put picnic tables there. You have not gone and mowed and carved out the trail. You have not put parking there. You have not put a trailhead sign there. Then it is just a meadow. And we're going to look at it and say it's a meadow. We're going to note its location, but we're not going to step into the meadow and look at whether or not the grass is accessible, which it is not. Grass is never an accessible surface. But if it's a little bit more than a meadow, you have put a picnic table there. There is a shelter. There is a sign that says, hey, here's a trail, and it goes 1.1 miles toward the ridge. Then that's different. Now we're going to evaluate all of those, but grass and dirt are never an accessible surface, so we're not going to walk that trail. But if now you're up here, if at the third level you have put in a trail that's decomposed granite or some kind of crushed stone or a poured trail, then that completely changes it, and the trail does have to meet requirements.
So you'll be guiding us on that?
Yes.
the report. Okay.
And we'll also give you priorities. So we'll set the priority based on the program access test, whether or not the guidance is final and enforceable. So we'll look at things like that.
Okay,
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question here? If grass isn't acceptable, what would be acceptable? What is the alternative to grasses?
There aren't a whole lot. I mean, at the one end, you've got grass or dirt, and then at the other end, you've got poured or planked. And in between, you can have crushed stone or decomposed granite. If you have a stone-type surface, every stone has to be smaller than 3/4 of an inch. So every state Department of Transportation has a table that shows the size of the stones and the many different types of stones that they use for everything from road construction to trail development. So usually, I'm sure the Illinois scale is about the same as the Connecticut scale. Usually there are only about 4 different types of stone materials that meet the access requirements. You can also use, I don't think you'd use it here, but in Florida, a lot of our jurisdictions there have used crushed shells. So they're very firm, they're very stable, they congeal together after a certain period of time. But like any other loose fill surface, it also requires maintenance. So if you have crushed stone and it rains a lot and you've got a rivulet going through the trail surface and it takes the stones away, then that's a problem. That instantly makes that site not accessible. So you can choose to use loose fill, but every time you do, you have to amp up the human resource hours that you're going to need to spend to maintain it. I think the bottom bullet point just talks about the flexibility that cities and towns and counties and states and special districts have. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, so each jurisdiction can look at what we have, look at what our resources are, look at what our priorities are, and then make decisions about, over time, how long it's going to take to make the retrofits that are necessary. Why audit sites? Congress actually did consider a requirement that every existing site had to be made accessible. So this was back around 1989, and they realized, okay, that's a great idea, and you were talking about that. I mean, it is the ideal goal, the ideal end result, but Congress realized that the cost would be so prohibitive to require all 89,000 units of state and local government to do this right away, so they couldn't. But the settlement was, we're going to audit sites, and we don't want you to audit sites because you're required to. We want you to audit sites just because it's the right thing to do. We've talked to the town staff a lot, and we know that the town wants to make sure that people with and without disabilities can enjoy the benefits and the opportunities that we provide at sites. So the next slide just talks a little bit about our process. I'm going to let Laurel talk for a minute, and I'm going to drink some water.
Sounds good. Yeah, so like John said, we do audit every facility that is owned, managed, and run by the town. And everyone laughs, we look at every accessible restroom stall. So we don't actually look at the standard size stalls. So in a multi-user restroom with 5 stalls, we're only measuring the grab bars, the toilet paper dispenser, that accessible stall at the end. We don't look at the standard stalls. Same with parking. We look at the accessible stalls at every location, and then we count the standard stalls. We use good old-fashioned tape measure. We all have our preference in tape measures, and so we use a 25-foot tape measure and a digital level. John likes to say that our eyeballs and feet don't have levels, but after you do this job for a while, you kind of start to feel slopes, is what we like to say. So we'll drop our level on sidewalks, in that accessible parking stall, in the restrooms, at a playground, looking for the numbers that meet the 2010 standards. And with technology, we use an app on our phones, and it kind of gives us a checklist that aligns with the 2010 standards for accessibility, and kind of creates that report. So we'll find deficits, we take a picture of it close up so that we can provide staff with the number or measurement of what needs to be fixed, and then a little bit of a reference photo so people know kind of where we were, and then we describe that.
Sometimes we'll see staff at a site that are all excited that we're taking pictures. They think, oh, they must really like our site because they're taking so many pictures. But it's kind of exactly the opposite, isn't it, Laurel?
Yes and no. So yes, we take pictures of deficits, but we also take pictures so we know how many, parking stalls there are. I would say there's way less photos of things that are great, but if we're taking a lot of photos, it's usually not the best thing. But it's not all bad, I promise. We also have staff, when they ask, when we're taking pictures, they want to come in and, let me just fix it real quick. And I said, no, let me still take the picture and then fix it, because you'll be able to check it off the list. And that feels great, anytime you can check it off the list.
Can you talk a tiny bit about the Connecticut difference regarding parking?
Parking, yes. Connecticut, on the previous slide when we talked about the federal standards and then more stringent state codes. So Connecticut does have some of those more stringent state codes around parking. So your combined access aisle, which is the striped zone next to an accessible stall, not for motorcycles, is the access aisle and the stall. So a standard one needs to be 15 feet wide, which exceeds the federal standard. So a federal parking stall needs to be 8 feet wide with a 5-foot access aisle, or 13 feet. Connecticut kind of extended both of those with some leeway on the numbers. And for a van accessible stall, it needs to be 16 feet wide. So 8-foot access aisle and 8-foot parking stall. You also have some new requirements for the parking signs. Federal standards is at 60 inches above the parking surface. And everyone's kind of familiar with that blue sign with the ISA, which is the International Symbol of Accessibility. Connecticut has some wording specific on their signs, as well as the dynamic or the moving ISA, kind of leaning forward. And that is moving forward. So all the signs that have been up for 15, 20 years still meet, but as you replace them, one falls off, it gets faded, you can't see it anymore. Then you have to have this newer parking sign per Connecticut standards.
All right, I have another question.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, it seems to me that people who are not handicapped use those spaces. For example, I know a woman who was caring for another woman. She would park in the handicap zone even though she was not with the woman who was handicapped. Another person I know walks through our supermarket and uses a handicap place. I don't really know how to think about it, and are there any actions that can be taken when you see the abuse of that?
Yes and no. So there are people who have limited mobility who are still eligible for the accessible placard or the hanging blue tag, or even the disabled veterans license plate and some other requirements. So not every disability is visible the way we see it that would require that symbol, or would require you parking there. If you're a caregiver and the person is not with you, John has a great kind of conversation around service animals. Like, if I have a service animal, my service animal is Rory, John can't take my service animal and just like hang out in town hall, because the service animal is for me specifically. Parking is very hard to...
But we have a good parking story too.
Yeah.
So it's a minor league baseball stadium, and they recruited a lot of the residents to be the parking monitors. So a guy drives through. So this is consistent with the notion that you can't tell from looking at somebody whether or not they have a disability. So a guy drives through in a Jeep, and he parks in the accessible parking stalls, and so all the parking monitors are running after him and yelling at him and saying, "You can't park there, that's for people with disabilities." So he reaches over and detaches his leg and holds half of his leg up.
Yep.
And he is qualified to park there. So you can't tell from looking whether or not somebody has a disability.
Yeah.
Well, the one I'm talking about, I know the woman who's the caretaker, and I know the woman she's taking care of, and she is misusing, clearly, I think.
Yeah, I think there are a couple solutions. I'm gonna sound like I'm in the third grade here, but one is to tell them, tell facility management, especially if it's a unit of local government. If it's a business, I think it's a little bit different to get a business to enforce it.
Right.
But we've also seen some jurisdictions say, we're going to increase the fine for parking in an accessible stall if you are not qualified to park there. And the fine is going to go to funding our access retrofits. So it's a nice way to kind of make the penalty fit part of what you're trying to protect. So there are a couple of different approaches, but telling on people sometimes works.
Yeah. And our last tool is our door gauge, and it kind of tests the pressure of how that pounds force to open a door inside a building or outside. So those are kind of a very simple tools: our door gauge, tape measure, and our digital level, and our phones to take pictures, and sunscreen.
And the cloud, whatever that is.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a picture of our tools kind of on a table, just so you can kind of see what they look like.
So this next part, I'm going to talk a little bit about what a transition plan is, and I'm going to talk about the factors that other jurisdictions around the country have said, hey, we want to consider this in deciding what we're going to address first. So again, the transition plan, you're going to see the word program up here again. It's intended to make the programs accessible. So every time you see this or hear this, think opportunities that the town provides. Dispersion is critical. You don't want to wind up with all of the accessible features in the north end of Darien or the west end of Darien. So it should be spread out throughout the community. There is good guidance from DOJ regarding unique sites. If there is a one-of-a-kind site like Town Hall, then that tends to wind up being a higher priority. For recurring sites, again, the whole playground discussion that we were having, arguably you could take one of three and start with that. Again, stretched out over how many years? This is an individual town-by-town determination. The longest we've ever had a community go was 24 years. That was a 500,000 gross population Phoenix suburb, and that project included public right-of-way, school assets, parks, and buildings that were owned by the city. Most of ours tend to wind up in the 10 to 12 to 15 year range. The next slide talks a little bit about the factors that other jurisdictions have considered. So one is the severity of the barrier. So I'm going to make up an example. If there is a building that has steps only and no stairs, steps only and no ramp, and I use a wheelchair, I can't get into it. So that's a more severe barrier that in this jurisdiction would be rated as a higher priority. The exact opposite of that could be a higher priority too, and that's low-hanging fruit. So things that the town can do with current human and fiscal resources, like there's a garbage can right by that door. That garbage can is probably in the maneuvering clearance for the door. And so moving that, making sure that staff know, hey, move that always to leave 24 inches of space there. That's a really simple training thing, and it assures you that you're going to have maneuvering clearance. I think one of the others is high-use sites. So if there is a site that is the most heavily used site within the town, some jurisdictions have said we're going to make that a priority, as well as if you're going to spend money making these retrofits, some jurisdictions have said we're going to make spaces used by the public have a higher priority than spaces used by an employee. The next slide talks about a couple of others. How recent is construction? If it is new construction and it is done wrong, I'll tell you, I was going to talk to you about this afterwards, Mike, but in another jurisdiction that is next to or near Darien, staff today saw staff for that community lining the accessible parking, and it was wrong. They were using designs from 1994 or 1997. So a lot of the standards have changed dramatically since then. So in a new site, that poses a more difficult problem because new must be compliant. So if it is new and it's not done right, then that's a higher priority for retrofit. Repurposed sites, a lot of jurisdictions all over the country have that old 105-year-old school that can't be used as a school anymore, so the town uses it for town hall, or it winds up being a recreation center or a senior center. Those are harder to retrofit, so those tend to be a little bit more later on in the priority order. Same with sites where there's a partner. A lot of towns partner up with a YMCA or a county or an adjacent town. That's great. The argument there is that you're going to share your resources to make a better facility. But from a retrofit perspective, that means you have to decide how much are you, the partner, willing to pay and how much am I willing to pay. So it tends to wind up being later in the priority list. Same for complex or costly retrofits. The next slide talks about the last three that I'll mention. So if any of these resonate with you, that's kind of what we want to hear from you. Sites not yet subject to the design standard. I mentioned trails earlier. There is not a final and enforceable Connecticut standard for trails, nor is there a final and enforceable federal requirement for trails. That guidance is there. It's been there since 2004. We can tell you exactly what we think an accessible trail should look like, but it's just not final and enforceable, and it's unlikely that this administration will issue that as a regulation. Compliance may be technically infeasible as well. The size of a bathroom footprint for the accessible stall has changed dramatically since 2010. So because of that, you may have an alteration underway, and if I have to move a load-bearing wall or element, then I don't have to meet the technical requirements for accessibility.
We redid our bathrooms at One Beach. We had hoped to replace the building, but that didn't work out. I won't get into that. So we said, all right, let's just make it look nicer. And in the process, in each of the men's and women's rooms, we had to go from 2 stalls to one.
To one.
And for exactly this reason. And we got complaints about it. And I was like, oh, you're a bunch of idiots. And I was like, you know.
Your hands were tied.
Our hands were tied.
Yeah.
People didn't want a new building, so.
We have one of the other Westcog clients that has a building that fits exactly on the piece of property that they own, but there's other property here, and ideally they should make retrofits on the other property, but it's not theirs, they don't own it. So those kind of situations where your ownership package is smaller, your hands are tied. The last two I think are important. Historic sites are not exempt. They do have to be audited. When we audit a historic site, in our site report, we say, before you make any of the retrofits here, check with the state historic preservation officer and make certain that none of the changes will threaten or destroy the historic significance of the site. Last but not least is sites with other protections, endangered species, endangered plant species or types. I'm not much of a plant guy, but you get the point here. If making an accessible route through an area would harm an endangered species, whether it's critters or flowers, then that's an issue that you don't have to do. Same with cemeteries. We are in New England, so there are a lot of Revolutionary War cemeteries here. It's going to be very difficult for you to create an accessible route through those cemeteries. So certainly sites with other protections like that, you do not have to make retrofits occur at. So some of what we saw here, and Laurel's going to walk you through this part. I'm going to sit down here for a minute and enjoy the pictures.
Yeah. Do we just want to take maybe like a 5-minute break?
Yes. How about that? Maybe we can answer a question or two.
Oh,
I was supposed to be somewhere at 1:30, I pushed it off, but
okay.
if we could
Slot.
for Carrie needs a break.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A quick break.
Okay.
Carrie, 5 minutes, good?
5 minutes, good. I
Great.
just want to,
Yeah, stretch
my
your
arms
arms,
down
yeah.
for 1 minute.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you're
I'm not
good.
trying to be that person, but
Yes, we
An
need
hour
to
long.
know. Yeah, I was
We
thinking
keep
of that.
talking.
We
Are there
can keep talking,
questions
yeah.
we can answer about the first half?
Just so I can let my other people know, if you give me another 20 minutes, or I got people waiting for me, so.
Probably 10 to 2 is what I'm thinking.
Because this is important, if you're going to cover the parks, I really want to be here, so I just don't want people.
I have a parking question. Is there a requirement that says what side of the car should have the extra feet to get out of the car?
Yes and no. So in an angled parking stall, so there's straight on parking, and then there's like angled parking.
Right.
On an angled stall, the angled van stall, the access aisle needs to be on the passenger side. So a lot of times what we see are, 2 accessible parking stalls, both angled, and then the 8-foot access aisle in the middle. So technically, both stalls have the width, they have the 16 feet, but the one on the right, the driver's door opens into the access aisle. So that's not an accessible van stall. But the right-hand side that isn't just a regular accessible stall. This is the van accessible stall on the left that the passenger door opens into that 8-foot access aisle.
That tends to be a state issue too.
Yeah.
So some states also will permit you, if I'm driving a lift-equipped van, they'll permit me to park wherever I want
Yeah.
within that 8-foot aisle and the access aisle. I can park diagonally in it, I can park straddling the striped area as well as the accessible stall. Other states don't. From conversations I have with wheelchair users who drive, they hate going to states where you can park kind of willy-nilly within the stall. But others like it because it gives them more flexibility.
Yeah. So for the straight pull-in stalls, because you can reverse in and because you can, forward, back, you are kind of in charge of what side of the aisle is. So the stringent is on the angled because that only provides one side. You can't back into an angled stall specifically. Helpful?
Yeah, I'll have to remember all the things about the angle, but I get the straight.
Yeah, and you really, it's very limited. That's a pretty minute part of ADA and accessible parking stalls. We hop back in. I know Marley just stepped out. But
Yeah, she was just grabbing some water.
Okay, then.
Carrie, I'm sorry too, I completely forgot.
Yeah.
Jen, I
Sorry,
forgot too.
yes. So these are some observations. Again, this is not, we seek the feedback. So this is not final. There's not a phasing for this. These are very common issues that we have seen all over, not only Connecticut, but everywhere we audit. As John just mentioned, we just had a big parking discussion. It's 2025, and we're using parking designs from 1994. No one's at fault for that, but it's very common to see a lot of these issues, just as the nature of local and state government. So I did a lot of the audits here in Darien. So parking is always an issue, again, because people use things from 1994, but just a couple of the little things that we noticed to put into this slideshow. Normal wear and tear, but that do cause issues. So at McGuane Park, and please correct me if I'm mispronouncing some of these names, I've been saying them. McGuane. Okay, see, exactly. I was like, I've been calling it one thing. I'm also Southern, so I apologize.
I've been calling it McGuane too.
Okay, great. Yes. Okay. Just some images that we have. The parking sign, the requirement is to be at 60 inches so that a driver of a van could see it, over the windshield. So we'd recommend raising these parking signs. Some of the parking, so this middle stall doesn't have an access aisle. Both of these on the outside do have the access aisle, basically making that middle one not technically an accessible parking stall, but it is labeled that. So somebody could be confused and pull in but not have the access aisle to unload into.
Does it need to be an access aisle on both sides?
There doesn't need to be one on both sides, and you can share an access aisle between two stalls, but every accessible stall needs some access aisle. So that 5-foot access aisle for a standard, or the 8-foot stall. Again, just wear and tear. We talk about gaps and changes in level. Obviously asphalt, cold, heat, expands, cracks. So there's a couple spots where you have some grass growing.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I'm not going to ask you if you've gone to McDonald's this week, but sometime in the next couple of weeks, make a point of going to a McDonald's and just pull in and look at their accessible parking. So McDonald's corporate has decided that concrete, which might cost a couple bucks more, cures at the right slope and lasts longer. So they make their accessible stalls out of concrete, and then the rest of the lot is asphalt. Hilton does the same thing at most of their properties. So maybe there's a lesson that we can take from the private sector on that. It might cost you a couple bucks more, but it lasts longer and it stays right for a longer period of time.
Yep. And same thing at another site, parking is kind of an issue everywhere. Nothing out of the ordinary, just kind of ongoing. And, we see, sand. One thing that we audited here, obviously in the kind of fall, spring, but a lot of times snow gets dumped and piled into these access aisles and parking stalls, and then making them unusable. So just, again, reminding maintenance, that's a priority. So, when you arrive at a site, you start with parking. The second part is that accessible route. How do you access the asset, whatever that might be? Again, just some very regular things that we saw coming into Town Hall, just outside. The cross slope is high. Cross slope has to be under 2.08%, so that a person in a wheelchair, wouldn't tip over potentially into the road. And then that cross slope is, going the path of travel. Running slope is if you were to go up. So in that second picture at Cherry Lawn to the freestanding restroom buildings, that slope's a little bit high at 6.2%. There's kind of slopes everywhere, it changes, but those are things that we see everywhere, but we're mindful of. Is how can we use a mobility device to access different locations. Parks, again, things that we see everywhere. We know how popular pickleball is, and so this court at Cherry Lawn didn't have that firm, stable, and slip-resistant route to those courts. You kind of have to traverse across some grass to get to them. And then at the kind of randomly at the grass, there's some stairs that also go to grass. So, you couldn't just make a route to the stairs because then the stairs would be a change in level. But since there's grass, there wasn't a route to those pickleballs. Pickleball is one of those assets that we kind of do that program access test in the 1 of 3. So when we look at all of the town, there might be other pickleball courts elsewhere that we would want to highlight as has a route, accessible, and then this would be something we could do later on. Same with this gazebo with picnic tables in them. So for a picnic table and a picnic area to be accessible, we say 2 picnic tables in a pavilion need clear wheelchair space on the end so that I can wheel my knees under. And it needs the 36 inches around. So in these smaller gazebos, it's kind of hard. A lot of times those route around narrows. But if you see like a larger picnic shelter, larger gazebo, those tables can have that 36 inches around the table with the designated wheelchair spots. And again, there was a road that wasn't it was a driving path, so it wasn't necessarily an accessible route out to that gazebo. It had larger rocks, so it did have some granite, and there were areas that might have been more crushed, but there were a lot of rocks that were an inch and a half, making it an inaccessible surface to traverse. And again, this is just a sampling. Beaches, we talked about beach access route and having a route down to the beach's water's edge. We did audit in like fall, winter. I know that, there's not, there are seasons that are more, it's more fun to go into the water up here, and it's probably not December. But having that route to the water's edge, there's different standards for if the water fluctuates, where that route would need to go to. As well as an outdoor shower. When we have a rinsing shower, that needs to be on a 59-inch hose, so something that I could maneuver as opposed to being up at 72 inches like a standard shower. We kind of apply those indoor locker room shower requirements to this outdoor shower type. Same thing, route to it. I know it's off season, so there was some overgrowth. So those are just things we documented for our report. Playgrounds, again, pretty common, especially with beach areas, is to have sand. Just like grass and dirt, sand is never going to be an accessible surface. It might be a safe playground surface, but it's not an accessible playground surface. So making sure that the playgrounds that one of the playgrounds that we saw had sand throughout it, but it did have that poured in place up to a couple different aspects, but it didn't have it at the exit points of those play components. When we talk about playgrounds and how they meet accessibility, we look at 2 things: the elevated play component, so what I would transfer in and get up to and play, the more large play structures, and then ground level play components, and we look at both aspects. But for those elevated, while there was, the poured in place to the transfer system, if I were to get onto it and go down the slide exits into the sand, so that's not an accessible surface. Same with the swings. There's not really a way to get to the swings. Swings are the ground level because you enter and exit it from the ground. You don't have to, climb up anything to get on a swing.
But if that's in the sand and there's nothing poured to an actual swing? It's not,
It's not an accessible,
Yeah.
basically, there's no route to the swings due to the sand surface. And-
So are you saying that everything in the playground, all toys or mechanisms, machines, slides and everything, all of those things need to be accessible? Every
Entrance and exit on playgrounds that are designated accessible. So this might be a playground that we just say leave alone until you replace. This might not be part of that 1 of 3 program access test that we talk about. But in 15 years when they decide to replace this playground, then we would say, hey, this in the future needs to meet accessibility.
And then for ground level pieces like,
Same.
I'm just gonna make up an example. If you
Yeah.
have 2 sand diggers, the requirement is that you must make 1 of each type accessible. So it's not unusual for us to see 2 sand diggers into a bed of sand, but there's a tongue of concrete here supporting this one. So I can wheel up to it, use the sand digger, pretend I'm making whatever I'm making. And then somebody else who doesn't use a wheelchair can do the same thing, but they might be standing in the sand. So 1 of each type of ground level components have to be addressed.
Yeah. And then real quick, I see your hand, but we talk about a space that is level, and kind of that number for us is 2.08. So when there's a slope, that means when I've parked my wheelchair to try to get out of my wheelchair, I'm at a bit more of an angle, and so it would be more challenging to transfer there. So we look for a clear space at this transfer system. So this has poured in place, but it has the slope in it. And this was, again, this one is at Cherry Lawn Park. One thing that was interesting, when we were auditing at Cherry Lawn, you kind of see how this engineered wood fiber, this is material that meshes together and can be an accessible surface when it's maintained correctly. The fibers kind of fuse together, but it has to be watered and compacted and refilled. So kind of the playground design at Cherry Lawn, where there's poured in place 2 different things and you exit onto engineered wood fiber, that's okay as long as the engineered wood fiber is maintained. While we were there, maintenance was actually out there blowing it and kind of brushing it back. So we got to talk to them about their process for maintaining the engineered wood fiber at this playground specifically. So yeah.
Did you?
Nope, okay, you just, okay. And then restrooms, again, parking and restrooms, we see it all. Things that we talk about is toilet paper dispensers. The center line of the toilet paper dispenser needs to be 7 to 9 inches in front of the toilet stall. Mainly because if you had a core injury, you don't want to have to lean too far forward or reach backwards. And when something has a range, they're pretty set that it has to be within that range. Some things in the ADA have a range and some have a set number. Bathrooms is something where there is a bit of a range. So toilet paper dispensers, probably one of the most common things that we see. This would be something we would, 1, train staff on, and 2, is a pretty easy retrofit to just move that center line to that 7 to 9 inches in front of the toilet seat. Closed flush, the flush on the closed side. So, if you're a wheelchair user, you don't want to have to reach over the toilet and have it spray up in your face. It's never fun.
Or put it this way, have you ever reached over the toilet
Yeah.
with your glasses in your front pocket?
Yeah, fun. And then seat height. So everything's kind of based on studying human ergonomics and transferring. So toilet seats, when they are too low, those spacers that sometimes you see in between them, there's a height range, again, for where the toilet seat is mounted, how far away from the wall it's mounted. There's a lot of ranges in the bathroom, but it has to be within that range.
And that
That's just a few things
gives
we
you
saw.
a peek at what we saw. So again, the role of community members is really important. The logo or the slogan for the ADA when it was going through Congress was nothing about us without us. So if any of the factors that we talked about earlier resonated with you, that's what we want to hear about. We can go out and measure the sites and tell you that the toilet seat is 17 to 19 inches, but is the toilet the reason you went to the park? That's really what the question becomes. What drew you to the site? Therefore, what should we recommend to the town that they address first? As far as what's next, the town staff will see all the site reports and the draft transition plan, interact with us about the priorities that we recommend, and then we'll make a final report to the town leadership at a date to be determined, and then staff continues implementation. We want to make it clear that we saw a lot of things that the town was doing that are fully compliant. So I think that's consistent with the way the town views its role as providing service to everybody within the town. And so now we want to hear from you, community member. Is there a preference that you had? Did any of the pieces that we talked about earlier with regard to public spaces first over employee spaces, or the basics? Should we recommend start with parking, entries, and restrooms, and then make a next priority be the reason you might go to the site, or should that be the first priority, the reason you actually go to the site? Any thoughts?
I do.
Please.
I would think that access to these kind of buildings, the Mather Center and Town Hall and the schools, would be the first. Parking, all of those things seem to be sort of basic to me. I mean, if you can't get into the building, then you can't use the building. So
The schools are not in this scope. That's a good point, and I should have mentioned that earlier. There are some parts of town infrastructure that aren't in the scope of the project. So one of those is sidewalks, and one of those are school properties, so both buildings and school grounds. But what I'm hearing you say is that a unique site like Town Hall should have a higher priority.
yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Okay. Any other thoughts from you on the order of retrofit for any of the other assets?
Not really.
How about you?
Once we get your report, I clearly will be discussing it with our commission and then working with the town staff to think about how we prioritize and then implement the changes. You said you didn't know the timing of the report. It's a little funny time of year because we go into a new budget July 1st, but the budget's not done, but essentially done.
On Monday it's done.
Yeah, so anyway, so in terms of having money available to do anything, we're looking at July 1st of 26
Right.
at best, unless somehow we can find money in the budget, but
Right.
there's usually not a lot of extra money left
Well,
in the budget, so.
in the transition plan itself, if we give you an Excel spreadsheet with, I'm just going to make up a number, 1,000 recommended retrofits, easily, it'll be at least that.
Yeah.
It will. So remember, we're going to count.
But it's gonna be
Yeah.
move that trash can
We're gonna count
out of
move that
your
trash
floor.
can.
Yeah. Some of it is, move
So
the trash can or.
Easily 30% of what you see in that Excel spreadsheet is things with no cost. It's things that you can do by
Okay.
making staff more aware of room layout, where to place garbage and recycle bins, and so
Okay,
forth.
so that's more operational, and Jen Faber, our Parks Director, we work with the staff, but then things in
Right.
terms of budgeting priorities, and that'll be something that our commission will be certainly discussing, digesting and discussing and prioritizing, over the next year.
I mean, we've had communities that have started with nothing but the low-hanging fruit and taken 1 or 2 fiscal years to get that and then make provisions for funding in upcoming budget years.
So then this will be very helpful, and I think it'll be a great educational component, because as we are planning and doing things in the park, we need to talk about this, explain why we're choosing certain surfaces, why we're expanding areas or doing what we're doing, and probably anybody who watches me on tape, will hear me say, it's not only that we're required to do it, but it is the right thing to do. So
Right.
that's already one of my taglines.
Absolutely.
But it is important, and any of us who have lived with elderly parents who can't get around or, have had, family members with degenerative diseases, we know what it's like navigating it. So
Well, part of this is the whole demographic issue. In 2022, the Census Bureau and the CDC predicted that by 2032, there would be more residents in Connecticut who are 65 or older than under 18 for the first time in history. That's important because if we surveyed all of Darien, your incidence of disability is probably 13 to 14%. But what do you think it is for 65 plus? It's 45%. It's 3 times. So CDC and the Census Bureau just a year later in 2023 changed the prediction to 2030. I'm confident it's really closer to 2029. So is this important for today? Yes. But the last thing we want is for Darien to wake up in 2027 at Thanksgiving and think, holy cow, this demographic wave is on top of us and we're not ready from a infrastructure perspective and a funding perspective. We mentioned the survey.
Yep.
So take a picture of this with your smartphone, spread it to all your friends, even people you don't like, and urge them to participate in the survey. And it takes about 5 minutes to complete.
Yep. Longer if you got a lot of opinions. Shorter if you're just checking boxes. This survey has been open for 2 weeks and is going to be open for 2 more weeks. I believe it closes, oh goodness, don't quote me on it.
22nd.
Thank you.
is it on the
Thank you.
website, Marley?
Yeah.
If you go on the homepage or anything, is
I don't know if it's on the website, I don't do
No.
website, but it's on the screen downstairs, it's on social media, and it's in the newsletter. So it's in the newsletter on the website.
So the newsletter that came out about this?
Yes, and it will be in tomorrow's
Okay.
newsletter as well.
Okay, good.
We could have a little contest here. We won't mention the town, but we do have a town that had almost 300 survey responses, so.
Oh, see, now you set the bar.
No pressure.
What do you think we're up to, Laurel?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I could probably tell you by tonight.
Because we started out
We
really
started
well.
big.
You did. We were like, what?
Yeah.
So I can let you know.
I think it's 4.
If Jen's coming tonight, I can let you know what the numbers are after
It would
5
be
today.
interesting to know
It would be.
today, because
Yes.
the newsletter goes out tomorrow too.
Oh, yeah, it
So
would be.
usually that's a bump.
Yeah, I'll ask. I
Yeah.
can find that out
Yeah,
easily.
we can find out.
Yeah.
Let you know tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah, that's 4.
Okay. That's our last official slide. It says
Okay.
thank you, but I'll thank you, but I will go back to the survey if somebody didn't get the link that they want. So
Any other questions or
questions?
comments?
Yeah. Hopefully it was informative. Again, the images are just a brief, couple snapshots. So
I have a question. Is there an ADA requirement for how wide a trail has to
It
be?
depends on the type of
Yeah.
trail. So trails, there's no such thing as one trail. So a trail, at the minimum, has to be at least 36 inches wide. And if it is only 36 inches wide, then you have to have a turning space, I believe it's every 200 feet. So you've got to have like a bump out, just think of it that way. If it is a shared use path, that's more of a transportation alternative, so I ride my bike to work instead of driving my car, then those are typically 10 feet wide, it's a poured surface, it might even have a stripe down the middle so people can stay on the correct side. So it depends on the type of trail and what it's used for.
and paths are also different. So we call an accessible route, again, is that 36 inches. If it's going to a building, it's final and enforceable and it needs to be that route. But if it's going to one picnic table, we call it an outdoor accessible, ORAR, outdoor recreation access route. So it's a different term, slightly different standards, slightly different enforceability, and then it depends on the surface. So concrete, pavers, wood planks have more stringent requirements. Crushed granite, crushed stone, engineered wood fiber, if it's the access route that's final enforceable, it has those same stringent standards. But if it's a crushed granite going somewhere else, the slopes change a little bit. So again, like when you say trail, that can mean a lot of different things. Trail, path, route, access route, not, it's all nuancy, and we still, talk about it every day because, this goes to this playground, but there's a bathroom over here, so there's a lot of nuances to ways people traverse park and park assets. Helpful and not helpful, I apologize.
I have no idea.
Sorry. Yeah.
And this,
Yeah.
I'll say that the first set of design standards came out in 1991 and they became effective in 1992. And they addressed doors, restrooms, building entries, parking. They didn't address anything in a park. So when the park standards came out in 2010 and became effective in 2012, it really changed the way towns look at parks, because before 2012, you walked or you rolled across or somebody pushed you across the grass to get to a playground or a sport field or a picnic pavilion. And that all changed with the 2012 implementation date for the 2010 standards. And so you do have to have a route through parks today. We'll look forward to
Yeah, excited for
connecting
tonight.
with you on the site reports, and I'm thinking too, if, when we are here to do the final report with you, if we can figure out a way to do it jointly with the park board or have
Representative or something.
something like that.
We can at least try to coordinate with Lori.
Okay, all right, great. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Of course, you haven't answered the big question in town, which is the Weed Beach.
Mike, any comments from you as we wrap up?
It all seems good.
All right.
Do you want to go down to Mather and check out the space?
Sure.
Can I
Carrie,
take a
thanks a
picture of
lot.
You guys, so much.
Thank you.
Can I take a picture of them?
Yes.
We would love that,